Good morning to you all at CUUC. It's good to be with you virtually this morning. Of course, I'm pre-recording this sermon, and I will be joining you at the end of your service for questions and answers about the 5 smooth stones of liberal religion. James Luther Adams lived the span of the 20th century and still is really the most influential theologian of liberal religion. He was a Unitarian minister who spent most of his career teaching at Harvard Divinity School, Andover Newton Theological School, and Meadville Lombard Theological School, which of course is our Unitarian Universalist Seminary in Chicago. JLA, as he was affectionately known at Meadville, taught at the seminary from 1937 to 1956. When I was a student at Meadville, my professors recalled when they were students sitting with JLA in the common room for hours in deep discussion. They cherished their time in the company of a most brilliant yet humble man. It is James Luther Adams who gave us the 5 smooth stones in his essay, Guiding Principles for a Free Faith. The 5 smooth stones are a reference to the biblical story of David and Goliath as told in 1 Samuel chapter 17. Most of us are familiar with it as the age-old tale of the courageous underdog who wins out over a mighty foe. The ancient story goes that the Israelites are at war with the Philistines. The two sides agree to choose one of the mightiest soldiers among them and pit the two in hand-to-hand combat. They agree that the losing side will become enslaved to the victor, so the stakes are high. The Philistines present their secret weapon, Goliath, a giant of a man almost 7 feet tall. The Israelites present David, a young man, rather small in stature, who has nothing more going for him than a promise from God that he will win the battle and become the king of the Israelites. Saul, the erstwhile king, puts David in a suit of armor and gives David his sword. With all that outsized gear, David can hardly walk, so he sheds the armor and picks up his sling. You see, David had been a shepherd all his life, and he was very skilled with a slingshot, since chasing predators away was critical to the survival of his flock. He was brave, too, at times, actually wresting sheep from the jaws of a lion or a bear. So David, unarmored but confident, grabs his sling, picks up 5 smooth stones from a nearby creek bed, and heads to the confrontation with Goliath. As David approaches the battle line, Goliath, who is heavily armed, taunts him. David replies that God is on his side and reaches in his pouch for a stone. With the first shot, David nails Goliath squarely in the forehead and fells the giant instantly. Now, being raised in a rather fundamentalist Christian family, James Luther Adams knew the David and Goliath story well, and he probably thought of it as a segment of biblical history which established the Davidic line of Israel's kings. But later, as a Unitarian minister and scholar, James Luther Adams, JLA, came to see the story as a metaphor for what he saw as the hallmarks of the liberal religion he practiced and taught. For JLA, Saul represented the Judeo-Christian religion wrapped in the straitjacket of sealed revelation. JLA saw the armor in which Saul outfitted David as religious doctrine. It serves a purpose, but is weighty and restrictive. David, without the armor, represents the nimbleness of a religion free of doctrine and stifling tradition. As I said before, JLA lived his entire life within the 20th century from 1901 to 1994. This span of time included 2 world wars, which profoundly shocked people and their belief in an all-powerful intervening God. The horrific wars dispelled the notion that with the modern era, humankind was kind of on this escalator of progress, moving toward greater and greater improvement. And great theological thinkers of the 1930s and 40s were forming concepts of God which no longer fit with tradition and doctrine. At the same time, quantum physics rendered the scientific notion of a predictable physical universe obsolete. And after World War II, technological advances were being made at a dizzying pace. Our society barely negotiated these rapid changes. The traditional underpinnings of our culture were beginning to buckle. James Luther Adams, who was raised a fundamentalist Christian, turned humanist in his young adult years, but then reconciled to a liberal Christianity in the form of Unitarianism. JLA, who understood the need to cast off the weight of old dogmas and creed, defined liberal religion in the form of 5 smooth stones, that the smooth stones that knocked out the giant of traditional religious people like you, the traditional religion that people like you and me struggle with. So let's take a look at these 5 smooth stones. The first, religious liberalism, depends on the principle that revelation is continuous. In other words, it's like our cousins, the United Church of Christ, say, God is still speaking. The human experience and meaning made of that experience cannot be, as Adam said, finally captured by any religious text or institution. Events described in the words and deeds of sacred text often point beyond themselves, and we make meaning of them in our own time and our own context. Larger truths are always unfolding, and that presents a challenge to us. It's not enough to say that we reject what we reject in the way of worn-out dogmas. We must also responsibly search for truth and meaning in our lives. We must search for ourselves the revelation that is ongoing. The second stone, all relations between persons ought ideally to rest on mutual, free consent and not on coercion. This means faith cannot be coerced. While there are some who want to be told what to believe, the rest of us want to exercise a free inquiry into the deeds, words, and actions of the prophets and saints of the ages. We do so with reason, tolerance, and humility. Our loyalty and conviction must arise from open discourse, and unexamined faith is not worth having. The second stone also suggests that we examine our faith together and are accountable to each other in our search for truth and meaning. We will not always agree on ultimate truth, so the key to being together in our diverse faith is covenant. Covenant is the bedrock of our faith tradition. The first pilgrims to escape the tyranny of the Church of England landed in Dedham, Massachusetts in 1641. They set out not to first erect a church and start worshiping right away, but they endeavored to sit with each other and discern for an entire year how they would be together and what their relationship would look like as they engaged church life. This is what covenant is, a sacred promise to be together and honor each other in our spiritual journeys. Covenant further requires trust, which cannot be forced or coerced. It is the time that we spend together in the course of our congregational lives that builds that trust. And finally, covenant requires love, what I call agape love, the kind of love for each other that persists in good times and bad through calm and conflict. The third stone, religious liberalism affirms the moral obligation to direct one's efforts toward the establishment of a just and loving community. It is this which makes the role of the prophet central and indispensable in liberalism. Well, we humans, who are by nature social animals, have always struggled with the tension between free will and our need to live cooperatively with each other. There is a tension between personal freedom and the need for ethical relationships, between individuals and the need for the needs of the greater good. Today in our society, ethics and the rule of law are the arbiters of a just society, but we are imperfect beings who often forget the obligations of our highest selves. The complexity of our society today lends itself to monumental injustices, despite efforts to safeguard against them. In this, we as Unitarian Universalists are called to a prophetic witness that demands the restoration of a just and loving community. In our congregations, we create communities together. The implication for us is how to create communities that are just and loving while maintaining the free inquiry and free association, which are so important to liberal religion. Again, we find ourselves in the tension between individualism and the good of the whole. And to ensure a just and loving community, we must be willing to give up some individual freedom. Adams refers to this as surrender. However, it is not a surrender that is forced or coerced. Surrender here must be voluntary and sincere. All aspects of the Unitarian Universalist community are voluntary, which is why being a member of our faith can be much more challenging than traditional prescriptive religions. Not only are we obliged to search for our own truth and meaning, but we are also asked to freely, willingly, and lovingly support others in their search. This communal support asks us to volunteer our time, talent, and resources for the benefit of the whole. Not always an easy task when so much competes for our attention these days. And on to the fourth smooth stone. We deny the Immaculate Conception of virtue and affirm the necessity of social incarnation. Adams says that there is no such thing as good in and of itself. Good must be incarnated. In other words, you have to do good in order to be good. Justice can come to fruition only through social, economic, and political institutions. A faith that tries to shape history by creating justice is a transformational faith. In other words, we must be the change we want to see in the world. We must walk the talk of social justice. Creating good in the here and now is a trademark of liberal religion, and we as Unitarian Universalists do fairly well at it and are known by it, known for showing up for justice in our yellow Side with Love t-shirts. A question we must continually ask ourselves is, are we living out our values as UUs? And if so, would there be enough proof to convict us of it? And finally, the fifth smooth stone. Liberalism holds that the resources, divine and human, that are available for the achievement of meaningful change justify an attitude of ultimate optimism. Our faith is a hopeful one. Adams qualifies ultimate optimism by saying it's not necessarily an immediate optimism. We're not talking unicorns and rainbows, but a persistent faith in the possibility of beloved community. This is what Theodore Parker meant when he said the arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We have persistent faith in the original blessing of being human and the good that humankind can generate through inspiration and connection to the divine. Our spiritual practices help us to connect with that which is greater and instill in us the ability to see beauty and feel love, even as we witness the worst of human calamity. Adams says, at the depths of human nature and at the boundaries of what we are, there are potential resources that can prevent a retreat into nihilism. Ours is a prophetic religion that knows well the struggle between justice and injustice, yet also knows that grace is always close at hand. Our eyes are wide open. We are realists with big hearts. We love this life in all its complexities and work to make it a joy to as many as possible. These are the 5 smooth stones in which James Luther Adams brilliantly sums up what we are called to do and be as liberal religionists and Unitarian Universalists. But like our 7 principles, the language is a bit abstract, making it a challenge to keep those stones handy for living out our faith. Connie Goodbread, who is the lead congregational consultant for our southern region, has kind of interpreted these 5 smooth stones into 5 smooth words. Let's take a look. The first stone, revelation is continuous, can be seen as hope, rather than accept the eternal damnation of a Calvinistic doctrine. We can determine for ourselves what Scripture means to us. Universalist Hosea Blue said, give them hope, not hell. The second stone, relationships are never coerced, simply reflects love. The love that comes with the free and voluntary relationships between us as we walk together in our search for truth and meaning. And the third stone, a just and loving community is our obligation, means we are about justice in our congregations and in our ever-widening circles of community outside our walls. The fourth stone, deny the immaculate conception of virtue, requires courage, for it takes courage to walk our talk and be agents of change in our communities. My congregation is involved in the work of the Faith Organization, fighting against injustice towards harmony. Along with 30 other churches, we are community organizers in Volusia County. I serve as co-chair of Faith, and I know firsthand the experience of trying to speak truth to power. At times when facing the county council, Being part of faith feels a little like David facing Goliath, for the council, as you know, is powerful and not particularly sympathetic to our justice issues like homelessness and affordable housing. But every once in a while, faith will knock some sense into Goliath with a win such as opening the first step shelter for the homeless in Volusia. It only took 5 years to get that done. We must do good to be good and preserve and persevere in our good works. Courage is required. And finally, the fifth stone, we have divine and human resources at hand to bring about meaningful change, which points to an ultimate optimism. Unitarian Universalists are unique in being optimistic about this life and imagining a heaven on earth rather than heaven that is removed from reality. Ultimate optimism is joyful, and as a joyful people, we have an unflagging hope of one day being in beloved community the world over. Hope, love, justice, courage, joy are 5 smooth stones we can remember and live into as a congregation. As you go forward in these challenging days, I encourage you to contemplate what these words mean to you as individuals and as a religious community. I encourage you to think about how you as a congregation might incorporate these highest ideals into everything you do collectively. Let hope, love, justice, courage, and joy be part of your mission and your identity. With them, I believe a congregation can grow in spirit and become a community which speaks volumes to the world and invites all who would walk with us to join in working toward a heaven on earth. I hope it may be so for you. Thank you for having me.